Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot of content today, and so I want to make sure that we have enough time for that and for questions. Thank you again for joining us for the Michigan Opioid Collaborative's Northern Michigan Roundtable. My name is Melissa DeMars, and I'm the Upper Peninsula Behavioral Health Consultant for the Michigan Opioid Collaborative. This month's topic is the intersection between human trafficking and drug trafficking. We have two excellent speakers today. Linda Solem is the SUD Prevention Specialist with Up North Prevention, and Lieutenant Kip Belcher with the Michigan State Police, who oversees the Drug Task Force units in Northern Michigan. Before we get to our topic, I'm going to have the MOC team introduce themselves, starting with Rob.
Hello, I'm Rob McMorrow, part of the MOC team. I'm a consulting addiction physician, and I will also work with Mid-Michigan Community Health Center and as a director of addiction medicine here. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Megan?
Good afternoon. My name is Megan Collette. I'm the behavioral health consultant for the Western region in Michigan.
Katrina?
Hi, I'm Katrina Hernandez. I am the behavioral health consultant for the Central region.
Thank you. And Joanna?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joanna Smith. I'm a behavioral health consultant with MOC, and I cover the Southeast Michigan region. And before we get started, we did want to give an overview of the services that Michigan Opioid Collaborative offers. So I'll give it 1 minute to just pull up on the screen there. Perfect. So the Michigan Opioid Collaborative is a grant-funded program that's aimed at increasing the availability of MOUD treatment in Michigan, as well as increasing awareness and education around all other substance use disorders as well. So MOC offers free same-day consultation services to providers for any patients with a substance use disorder. MOC also offers quarterly introduction to buprenorphine trainings, as well as webinars on a variety of educational topics related to addiction, healthcare, and substance use. So additionally, we also provide support for the diagnosis, treatment planning, and medication management for pregnant and perinatal patients with substance use disorders as well. We also have a hepatologist on staff who offers Hep C treatment consultations within 48 hours. She facilitates a biweekly case consultation webinar to review cases with providers. And she's also developed a 3-part webinar series on Hep C treatment. We also have created toolkits for providers to have more resources when treating patients with multiple substance use disorders. And if you have any questions about the services we offer or how we can further support you, please feel free to reach out to your regional behavioral health consultant. We'll also be reaching out to you after the webinar or after this roundtable today to let you know that we're available and answer any questions that you have. So thank you very much for being here today, and I'll throw it back to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Joanna. Okay, so we're going to get into our topic. One thing, we're going to hold questions for the end of the presentation today. So if you have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat, and we will monitor those and we'll make sure that we have them ready for the end of the presentations. So I am going to turn it over to our first speaker, Linda Solem, and she'll be speaking on human trafficking. So Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you and just let me know when to advance your slide.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for having us, and it's been great to work with you and your team. So yeah, I'm going to talk on the subject of human sex trafficking, and it's a booming business, and kind of answer your questions that have been put forth. I think by the time we get through the presentation, you'll have some questions answered, but you might even have more. So we'll be talking about signs to watch for, how to identify, what are the risks and protective measures that we can be aware of. And this will basically just be an overview presentation to start the conversation around this topic. Okay, next slide. human sex trafficking is closely connected to substance use disorders. And sometimes we have that backwards. We think that there's substance use disorders can lead to sex trafficking, and sometimes it's the other way around. And the sex trafficking is what leads to substance use disorders. And sometimes we can have this awareness and understanding. We can be looking for what the backstory is and what really is some of the dynamics behind even their substance use disorders. The drugs commonly used to exploit a victim: GHB, rohypnol, ketamine, and ecstasy. And those are some of the chosen drugs because it confines and suppresses a person's ability to fight back, and their memory can be compromised. So they can come out of an exploitative type situation and not remember anything, and it can look like this person didn't try to put up a fight and what have you, and it can all be because of the particular substance that the person was given. Those drugs in particular are colorless and odorless and tasteless. They act fast and they leave quickly. So by the time an exam is taken or report given, these drugs don't typically show up. There's even more drugs available now that aren't even on your that basic screen. So a request would need to be made for a deeper screen to go into more drug assessment, and that usually costs extra money, and it's not something that is usually done. It's difficult to conduct a criminal investigation because of some of these factors and others that surround the situation. And hopefully we'll understand that a little bit better as we go along. And once the addiction sets in, so does their dependence on their trafficker. So it is something that a trafficker groomer does set out to do, is to pull them into an addictive situation with substances. All right, the next slide. Sex trafficking and commercialized sex acts. Sex trafficking has three elements that is always present. That's the use of force, fraud, and coercion to cause a commercial sex act with an adult. Now, sextortion is something that is also moving to the forefront. With the trafficking and online exploitation, they're often interconnected. 47% of victims experience daily threats from predators. Also, if a child is involved, it is automatically sex trafficking, no exceptions. So there's a lot of scenarios and a lot of backstory that can be given to what that would look like. And so at any rate, that can be part of further conversation. Commercialized sex act is a forced sex act, pornography, and sexual performance done in exchange for any item of value. That's including money, drugs, shelter, food, or clothes. So sometimes they can be forced into a situation. They're given promises of new clothes or, great opportunities and what have you. And so they take the drugs, they live at the house, they get food, clothes, that kind of thing. And it can sometimes be missed because it looks like it's a willing type situation when in fact it didn't start out that way. Next slide. So it thrives because of the serious demand that drives it. A buyer fuels the market with their money. So Michigan is ranked in the top 10 states for human trafficking in 2019 with 364 cases. And that's according to the Polaris Project, which operates the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline. And at the end of this presentation, I do have a couple of numbers for you, one being the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And I recommend that you put that in your cell phone. It is always good to have that on hand. You never know when you might use it, and especially as you become more aware and start understanding the dynamics around it. It's always good to have that number right at your fingertips to help if that is the source of the situation. The Michigan Abolitionist Project, which works to end trafficking, estimates that the actual numbers are closer to 1,100 to 1,400 individuals, and that's September 10th, 2021. So there were 1,186 signals that were received on the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline in 2021. 526 of those signals were victims or survivors of human trafficking. Signals are primarily phone calls, but they can be text messages, they can be DMs. They just have extended out in a wide horizon for people to contact them if they are in need. And I also wanted to mention, I've had people reach out to me with people that are missing, kids that are missing, and I always give them that National Human Trafficking Hotline. And they work very closely with law enforcement, and they work throughout the nation. So, and I know for a fact they work very well together through our state. So it's very important that we keep that in mind also with missing children. And they can connect and sometimes run that down and find people a lot quicker than if it is just law enforcement on their own. So, so a little bit more about what that demand is. Well, there's money to be made by selling a person 10 times in a night than one drug deal. One drug deal is for that night, that moment. Maybe it's another week, 10 days, whenever that would happen again. So with a person, they can have 10 customers and use that one person to make 10 times the money they do on a drug deal. So it's a very lucrative business, and it has become the newest commodity. And sadly, it's moving towards our children. And we'll have a little bit more in that in a future slide. But according to the International Labor Organization, 2/3 of the estimated total of the US, that's 150 billion or 99 billion, come from commercial sexual exploitation. So if there's ever a question and people wonder, is this really here? Is this really happening? I think the numbers show it, and that it's here and it is happening. So it's more about what does this look like and how can we address it and how can we do it better than maybe how we've done it so far. A trafficker exploits victims to earn the revenue from selling of a person as a commodity. And that's just something that's just hard to even think about, but it's something that we have to come to terms with, that that's the mentality of these traffickers and groomers and their victims that they're going after. It's just all part of making money to them, and it's just something to sell. A victim can be male or female, a child that is bought and sold for profit. The statistics that I've seen is 90 to 95% are female victims. It's just my humble opinion that if we get things in place that help women and children, that is going to help the boys and the men that find themselves in this predicament as well. So, and it is growing in the capacity for children. So payment can be in the form of drugs, keeping the victims in the cycle, most importantly, when they didn't choose it for themselves. And that, I think, is a very important part of the backstory when we're trying to help these people. Yes, when you're in recovery, you're going to start there and you're going to move them into, overcome their barriers and move them into a healthier place and making their decisions. But if it came from this particular point in their time, in their life, where they were trafficked, and that's what has brought them to where they are now, there is a whole nother backstory to try to deal with their psychological factors as well. The next slide. So the 2021 Federal Human Trafficking Report, which is a Michigan State report, you can see by this that on the eastern side, there is new cases and convictions that are kind of moving along, but even at that, it's only 8 and 9. And on the western, there were only 2 and 1 as far as new criminal cases and convictions by district. So this is kind of a wake-up call to see this and realize that data is not being, and statistics are not being gathered. So there's this whole piece of kind of people out there that need kind of a little different approach to things, and we aren't even keeping track of it. New defendants in 2021 was 10 and active was 42. And we know by the stats that we just read, if there were 364 cases in the state of Michigan, that this isn't really a very accurate depiction. Okay, next slide. So this goes with that other slide. It's one page, but I wanted to divide it up so you could see it better. According to these statistics of victims, 33% were adults, 67 were minor. So that's under the age of 18, and that's just what they got from the data they could gather. And it says female was 100%, 0 for male, and 100% for sex trafficking, none in forced labor. So obviously for our state, especially northern lower Michigan, we do have a lot of farms. We do have a lot of immigration things that are being watched. And so obviously we've not dug into that. We've not even looked in that area for what is happening as far as forced labor and even the sex trafficking within that. However, the good news is the conviction rate was 91%. One resolved at a trial court. Imprisonment was 100%. Defendants were sentenced to a term of imprisonment, and 157 months was the average prison sentence. And restitution was 20%. 2 out of 10 defendants in cases with at least one ID'd victim ordered to pay restitution. And 2 of those cases were charged outside of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Next slide. So this is just a graph showing us the new criminal human trafficking cases. You can see just from 2017 and then the 2019, 2020, we can see what COVID did. And then it's up to 2021 that has spiked up. Now for the new criminal human trafficking defendants trend, that was up a little higher in 2017. And that went down, and now it's still down there a little bit in the lower. So maybe there's been some advancement there. Convictions trend, I'm just going to jump to 2019 and 20. That kind of stayed up there, and 2021 is catching up. All right, next slide. Okay, and this is just in reference to a case, United States versus Toronto and Davis. And I'm going to just let you have that for reference and move ahead to the next slide. So trafficking in Michigan, is it here and what does it look like? Yes, it is. And this is just one story by Teresa Flores. She wrote the book, The Slave Across the Street. And she outlines her experience as a sex slave. She just in a brief 30 seconds, she moved to Birmingham in the Detroit area, which is high class, high socioeconomic level. And there was a boy at school that offered to give her a drive home, and she was all excited about it, had a big crush on him, and he takes her to his house, gives her something to drink, and then proceeds to take her to his room and rape her, and his cousin is there taking pictures. And so then he threatened her that you are going to have to do whatever he says. He threatened to kill her family, threatened to tell her teachers, and she was like straight A student, cheerleader, and all of that. So he proceeded to pick her up in the middle of the night for 3, 4, 5 nights a week. And she was doing it because she felt like she was protecting her family. And I think that's really key to think of the psychological factor that can be surrounding trafficked victims and their thinking. She finally tried to get away, and they put her in some real dump hotel, and they beat her and raped her and took her clothes, and she crawled to some, corner store, and they called the police and the parents, and they're all like, I don't know what happened to her. She was never like this before. I don't understand what's changed, So I always have my ears open when I hear things that, wow, this was a straight A student, or this was a cheerleader, and now they're doing drugs or dating the wrong person or something like that. And it's always kind of worth perking up your ears to go wonder what else is going on. Is there threats? Is there coercion? Is there force involved in that scenario? All right, next slide. So Michigan, why Michigan? Michigan has several factors that make it more susceptible to trafficking. One is that we're connected to an international border, Canada. We have all the water around us. We also have highways, which make travel in and out of the state quick and discreet. And a lot of local trafficking occurs at truck stops on highways in which runaway children are picked up. So something else of interest to that is that Grand Rapids, just a few years back, and I'm sure they're still in the top 10, but they were the #2 city for sex trafficking. And that's because they were such a great spot for the truckers to do their exchanges and then make it to Toledo, Ohio. And Toledo, Ohio is the hub across the nation for trucking. So Grand Rapids ended up being a very big hot spot for trafficking, which is somewhat amazing when you think about that being such a conservative community there. It also occurs in Detroit, Ann Arbor, Kalamazoo, Lansing, and Mackinac Island. And this information is from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, reported by the Polaris Project. Next slide, please. So traffickers use techniques to ensure compliance and meet demand. They use fear, violence, intimidation, and threats. One of the things that had happened to Teresa Flores also was that when she tried to get away from the traffickers, her dog suspiciously went missing. And then she had signs up, they're looking for the dog, and she receives a phone call from her traffickers, and she hears her dog bark and a gun go off. So they killed her dog. So the techniques that they use are probably beyond our own imagination, and they don't, the survivors and the victims, they don't talk about it. They don't think it's unusual. They just are living it. Next slide. So the stigma that is surrounding human sex trafficking, just a few points on that. Some may call it prostitution, but federal law calls it sex trafficking. I think we've really moved in that direction in a real positive way. We do talk about victims, but now we're even moving towards calling them survivors. They're a victim to the point that they come up and they ask for help. So if they're in recovery, or they're trying to get detox, or they want to get away from that person, or whatever their situation is, they immediately become a survivor at that point. They can identify with that. They can't identify with being a victim because they don't think they are. The psychological piece behind it all that has been put on them and into them from their trafficker is what kind of misconstrues their own perception of themselves. Because of the social stigma or misinformation, victims are mostly unidentified. Victims are silenced by fear and the control of the trafficker. They say prostitutes want to be sex workers or use their bodies to pay for drugs. Well, I'll tell you what, I can't think of too many little girls that had little dreams of growing up to be used and be raped 10 times in a night. I just don't think that's a little girl's dream. So I really don't think they want to be sex workers. And I think we really have to look a little bit further and see what got them to that point and remove that stigma for them. Many times they're pigeonholed into treatment for surface issues. And since this is reported mainly through self-reporting, statistics are lacking on the full extent of traffic victims. I think that's why we see such low statistics. And I think that's why data is so hard to come by. Many times victims are overlooked as druggies instead of sex trafficked victims. Next slide, please. So how do traffickers find and lure victims? They find them through social media,
Okay, so I'm all done in here.
home neighborhoods, clubs or bars, internet, school, apps on phones. The big thing, even back to that sextortion point, a lot of that is coming through the internet, the apps on the phone. There is an app, the Snapchat chat, they have maps and they can show the location of the child in the house. So if they're connected with a groomer on that app, this predator could actually come right to their house and find them in the actual room that they're in. So there's a lot of prevention work that can be done in this area, and first starting with awareness and knowledge. So how do they get lured through? Through promises of protection, love, adventure, a home, opportunity. Next slide. So risk and protective factors. The most common age a child enters sex trafficking is 14 to 16 years old. And I actually just read a new statistic. It's actually 12 to 14 now. So it has moved down into even more of a child in the lower minor age. The risk is they're too young and naive to really realize what's happening. Separation from family. Here, come meet me. Come, I'll take you here. I'll take you there. Runaways are caught into sex trafficking within 48 hours. That's why it is so imperative that you call the human sex trafficking number, right along with somebody who's run away or with law enforcement, because they can get on that very quickly because they know that's pretty much the route that some of these runaways will be caught up into. There's lack of freedom or identity. They have lack of education. They maybe have no identification. Those are some of the risk factors, and leading to substance use disorders, domestic violence, delinquency, teenage pregnancy, STDs, and abortion. Some of those teenage pregnancies can be by their groomer or even by a John. So these risk factors are pretty high. Next slide. This is a Michigan 2021 report card on child and youth sex trafficking. We obviously aren't doing very good. I know in past years we were still only maybe at a C and D, but it does look like we have gone down. They do have a toolkit, and there is a website that you can learn more on this. I just wanted to put it up for a little bit of kind of an awareness piece to be able to see the things that we're being graded on and how we're doing. Next slide. Indicators of human trafficking and trauma-informed responses. Some of the indicators of someone being trafficked is that they avoid eye contact, they can be malnourished, have fatigue, untreated illness, injuries. They have no control of money or identification. There can be possible signs of physical abuse, restraint, or confinement. Evidence of verbal threats, psychological control, emotional abuse, and they're constantly monitored. They're unable to speak for themselves. So what would be some trauma-informed responses? And most of us are all trained on that, and that's kind of what we're already, how we're already practicing and playing our roles in our fields. But just as an overview, we begin with understanding the physical, social, and emotional impact. Safety, create a trusted space. Trustworthiness, create trustworthiness and transparency. Hook them up with some peer support. Give them empowerment, give them a voice, give them a choice of what they want to do. We really can't go in at them as like we tell them. We need to bring that out. Cultural, historical, and gender issues, and realize that when asked what's wrong becomes what happened. All right, next slide, please. So our evidence-based interventions, we pretty much, like I mentioned, practice these things. So where can we see that, and how can this be used and utilized? Well, our emergency services, crisis intervention, emergency shelter, urgent medical care. Training is of essential. In 2014, there were 21 new laws put into place, and one was that there would be training yearly on human sex trafficking. And I can say that's probably fallen by the wayside since COVID, and that might be really worth implementing. We want to have safety planning, food and clothing, social services, case management, job training, legal services, and possibly move even to a point where we can vacate convictions. I'm just going to make a quick mention here as we're getting close to the end. There is a new, I did just hear of a new group. It's called HEAT, H-E-A-T, and that's Human Experts Advisory Team. And they are willing to help any organization with survivors and or that work with survivors, and really how to do best practices and how to work best with them. And I probably can get more information on that and get that to Melissa once I learn more. But you can also maybe look that up as well. Leslie King is a founder of that, and she's with Sacred Beginnings in Grand Rapids. She's a survivor of 17 years. And so she's, and she heads up and is the head of the Sacred Beginnings. Pardon me? Oh, okay. So any rate, she would be very, very helpful in this work as we go forward in our approaches. All right, next slide. So this is just what we can do next, and just keep having these conversations, stay informed. Reporting tips is also something that's good to have that phone number with. Keep asking questions, support local efforts, start some collaborations and coalition work. Work with law enforcement, bring together all the different elements that can work together in servicing, not only seeing and recognizing the indications, but in putting together the interventions that we may need in our communities. Next slide. All right, this is just a quick 6-minute YouTube video, which I've asked for Melissa to put in the chat. It will really open your eyes kind of visually to see what it actually looks like. These are real stories. These are real people. And this comes out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. So it will answer the question, is it really here? All right, next slide. And these are the phone numbers. Please feel free to jot those down, put those in your phone. At least we all can be working together in that way. And the next screen. Yep, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. Such important information to know. Thank you. I will put the link in the chat. I can't highlight it when I'm screen sharing, but I will make sure it gets in there by the end. Thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Lieutenant Belcher, and just let me know when to advance your slide.
Okay, I appreciate it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I'm Kip Belcher, and as Melissa said, I work with the task force groups in Northern Michigan. Focus is still primarily on controlled substances, but we do also work with emerging crime and have had some experiences working on human trafficking cases here over the last handful of years. Linda did a great job with really providing some good detail on what human trafficking is and what it constitutes and things to look for. So I'm going to complement what she has to say. But the first part of this is just a quick overview on what we're seeing in our world of drug enforcement with substances these days and how it's changed. And then I'll migrate right into the human trafficking and go through a few slides there about what we've done and what our cases have looked like in that world. So this first slide here just goes to show some of the different things that we're seeing these days, a lot of different colors and schematics and designs. And the whole idea with traffickers of drugs is to expand your client base. So how do you do that? You make things more interesting, new, visually stimulating. So this is what you do. And this is now crossed into counterfeit tablets that are no longer what they're purported to be, such as oxycodone. And we'll get into that, where you're finding tablets. People are buying pill press equipment and making tablets that have meth or even straight fentanyl in them. But you can see here with the colors that this might be more interesting to someone in their teens. And then we start to see affiliation with drug misuse and problems that develop with that. Next slide. And just on that xylazine, for those of you not familiar with that, and that was on the prior slide, we don't need to go back to that, but that is a veterinary substance there. Years ago, we used to see a lot of things going on with something called ketamine, which is in the veterinary world too. It's an anesthetic used for surgery and vet clinics. And there was some misuse with that. It's kind of a psychedelic type of drug, similar to LSD. So now we're seeing some heroin and fentanyl mixed with xylazine. So issues coming back with some of our veterinary establishments, and they're not always known for being extremely protective of their substances in there, because you wouldn't think someone would be interested in breaking into a vet clinic. This goes to show you here our microdata, and this is just our in Lansing where we record our arrest data. And you can see here, just going through this, how much meth, about 2/3 of the way down, has increased in cases between 2020, this is calendar year, and 2021 calendar year, up 21% in the meth category. You can see where heroin by itself has gone downward, LSD has gone downward. Barbiturates is up quite a bit. Quite a bit of change there, but primarily the emphasis here is on the meth percentage increase. And you see how substantial that is. And that's what we're primarily seeing with my task force groups as far as the substance most popular right now for sale and consumption is methamphetamine coming out of Mexico. It's no longer the mom and pop shake and bake type thing in the 2-liter Verner's bottle. It's cheaper and a much stronger substance just to buy it directly from suppliers that originate in Mexico. Next slide, please. This goes just a quick map here that shows between 2020 and 2021 what we're seeing on meth arrests statewide. And you can see going left to right that some areas that were not red, which is the most extreme locations for meth arrests, you can see where those have turned to red, and you can see where the yellow quadrants there that were medium level meth arrest category have many of those transitioned to orange. And you can see, of course, where the orange went to red. And you can see that on the right side there for 2021, looks to me like a good chunk of Crawford County is in that, has gone to red. So that's problematic for us. And obviously up in the Upper Peninsula there through Munising, Marquette, there's some difficulties there with methamphetamine too that have exacerbated itself, and that's problematic. So gives you an idea of the expansion of it. It's not extremely popular in some of the more metro locations. That still stays with heroin and fentanyl, but we can, other than Marquette up there where it's and Munising where there's some difficulties with meth. So we'll flip to the next slide. And this goes to show, I talked about the mom and pop shake and bake thing. Well, there was a time where you could mix everything, all your ingredients. You could run down to the pharmacy and get what you needed there. As far as ephedrine, you could run over to the hardware store and get some Coleman fuel, and you needed lithium batteries, and you could throw everything into a bottle and it would react in different stages. You had to be careful not to fall asleep because you had to release the pressure by unscrewing the cap on that thing. If you didn't, you'd have a potential small bomb that would detonate. But there's no longer a need to risk your well-being in that fashion by making the stuff yourself. And hence we see the decline in labs over the year. This is the number of laboratory incidents, and this is also components, active labs and component situations where it was evident that labs were present. And if you go left to right, you see where quite a few across the state, and 524 in 2017, and all the way down to only 30 in 2021. So meth labs, and they are a dangerous circumstance. Issues with cleanup and contamination of property and all sorts of things going on, exposure to young children that are in those environments, because people involved with manufacturing meth and using it oftentimes have children. They don't make a wise decision not to. I mean, life goes on. This is their life. And part of their life includes drug distribution, consumption, and having children. So next slide. And this goes to show, this is all of our state police labs across the state. And it looks at 3 of the more common chemical drugs. and it shows you, again, going from left to right for each drug item, 2018 to 2021 calendar year. We see where cocaine is still, it's made in appearance and it's becoming more predominant. We're seeing more of it. It had kind of fallen off the grid to some extent there for several years. Heroin, again, heroin by itself, not heroin with fentanyl, but just straight heroin, is declining substantially. We rarely see any more tests, substance tests that turn to straight heroin. It's pretty uncommon now. And methamphetamine, substantially elevated, all the way up to 5,289 confirmed samples in calendar year 2021. So that's where our issue is at, just on the drug front. Next slide, please. And here we have our deaths, the death calculations or statistics. And we see again, we're just opioids with heroin only, and that's the third set bar graph over, not a tremendous amount more than what we'd want to have, but not a tremendous amount. Opioids with cocaine, again, on a lesser level. Where we see the biggest issue with deaths in Michigan, and this is for 4 years. So this isn't a 1 year stint. This is for a combined, actually, this would be just for 1 year. And that purple bar graph, opioids, including fentanyl, for 1 year, over 1,200 deaths. And fentanyl is the driving force. A lot of people involved with opioid misuse have adjusted to the physiological demands that heroin places on the body, and they've merged into the fentanyl world because it's more of a kick. It's more of that near-death experience that a lot of people using hardcore opioid substances, heroin, fentanyl, carfentanil, want to experience. And heroin wasn't getting it done by itself anymore. So branched into fentanyl, and unfortunately, you don't always know what you're buying. You're not always an expert, especially when you're under the influence, with what your mixture ratio is with heroin and fentanyl, or with cocaine and fentanyl, or with meth and fentanyl. And if you take too much, there's a problem that develops respiratory wise, and it may not be recoverable even with Narcan being available. Next slide, please. This just goes to show our labs, and they're coded there at the bottom: Bridgeport, Grayling, Grand Rapids, Lansing, Marquette's over there on the right, Northville. And you can see methamphetamine substances tested are the orange portion of each individual bar graph set. So other than a couple of labs here, methamphetamine runs away with the show right now as far as tested substances across the board. Next slide. And this, some findings that are interesting. I wanted to include this, and I won't hit on all of it, but well, back a slide, please. Under cocaine there, one significant change. They used to see at the lab very few pure samples, but now 60 to 80% of what's incoming is classed as a pure sample. And I don't know what percentage that has to be in the lab environment to be considered a pure sample. But what I can tell you is about 2 to 3 months ago, my SANE office, which operates through the Straits area south of the bridge, seized some compressed cocaine. I forget what it was, 12 to 16 ounces of it. And by compressed, I mean, it looks like it came off a brick, like actually a brick that you would use to as a foundation of a house there, or as a building material, where it would be encrusted and solid. And that's how this cocaine was formed. And that's a sign with the cocaine that it's more pure than not. But what was also interesting on this is that stamped on the cocaine was the letter, excuse me, the letter F was stamped on there. That's clearly visible in some of the photographs. I don't think we have that here, but that's uncommon to see that. And that's just one of the hundreds in all likelihood, of trade stampings or trademark stampings that distributors at the high level of business in Mexico, in the cartel environment itself, would stamp on their packages of cocaine to mark those as being their property. So to see that make its way all the way up to northern Michigan and know that you're only a couple or three steps removed from an actual cartel environment is concerning, to say the least. Down there at the bottom, under opioids, you see where 93% of the samples the lab got their hands on contained fentanyl. So again, heroin by itself actually becoming extremely uncommon right now. Next slide, please. Again, this gives you a breakdown. 7% of the opioid samples that the labs put their hands on this year and analyzed did not have fentanyl in it, only 7%. Next slide, please. Another graphic example of opioid samples by lab. We see the fentanyl there in the gray. And you see that at every single lab, fentanyl was a predominant ingredient in the opioid samples that they were testing across the board, statewide. There it was. Next slide, please. Now we're going to move into just some sex trafficking, or rather human trafficking, and of which sex trafficking is a part of it. What we see in the law enforcement end of things, and again, Linda did a great job with outlining and providing a lot of great detail on what it amounts to and the different forms of this and information on it statistically. So that's not something I'm going to touch on. The two things that my groups and that law enforcement in the area here have typically seen has been human trafficking in the form of sex trafficking, either coerced in some form or fashion, or on occasion some independent people working that are not being trafficked. Escort services is one form of that. We'll get into some of that here as far as websites and different things like that. Pornography production, which unfortunately involves a great deal of minor, very young children being exploited in that manner. And there is a huge customer base for that type of material to be streamed into people's homes, is very young children, all the way from, it's unbelievable, but just a year, 18 months old up into preteen, 8, 10, 6 years of age. So it's tough to imagine that, but there is an appetite for that type of material for some people to receive it. And forced labor is the other one, and this is something we've ran into as well. The statistics I've seen, it's about 90-10 sex trafficking to forced labor. But we see here with prevalent at restaurants. I've seen this in agricultural environments, particularly on the northwestern side of Michigan. We have a lot of farm situations where a lot of labor is needed to harvest crops over, particularly in Benzie and Leelanau counties in the area that I cover. So we've ran into this on occasion. And other things, we do have carnivals up this way, construction. We do have a number of places like resorts, and I think they do by and large a pretty good job of that. But if you follow that trail down a step or two, you don't know what's going on that back end of it when people from Nicaragua or Costa Rica are coming across what exactly is going on down that way as far as the impetus for them to come up and work in northern Michigan. Is there some sort of coercion or threat type environment going on in the home country where they were able to get a worker across the border, and maybe on paper it looks good, but you could still have a trafficking situation there of some sort. Next slide. And this just goes, and again, I'm not going to touch on too much of this. Linda hit on some some substantial statistical information there. Again, about 90% of the cases that are encountered here in Michigan, if not more, but at least 90% are sex themed with that. This is a transnational. This is not just the United States. This is across the world. This is a huge industry. That figure that Linda and I have, that's a recent one, but I would tend to think that is probably that $150 billion industry. If I had to guess, I'd say that is way, way on the low side, that it's probably exceeds into the hundreds of billions, and it may even trickle into the next numerical set of numbers there beyond $1 billion. Wouldn't surprise me at all. So, and again, Linda mentioned this, top 10 states nationally. That's not an area where you want to be ranked highly in, but we are there in that area. So, next slide, please. Some of my slides got mixed up here, so not sure how that happened. Anyway, just finding in our going back and talking on our drug circumstances here, we find that tramadol is in there, a mild pain ingredient, and some of the things that the lab is seeing. Again, xylazine in 10 to 20% of the opioid samples tested by the lab. Again, that's a veterinary anesthetic, becoming a little bit more popular. Cutting agents, other cutting agents in opioid samples, and we saw this in cocaine years ago. And you can go down to GNC if they still have storefronts. There used to be one in the mall in Traverse City. I don't know if it's still there or not, but these are very common. Vitamin powders, inositol, mannitol are very common. The idea is to take the cocaine, like I talked about, or the heroin or meth or whatever it is, and divide that up further so you have more of the product to sell while still maintaining a decent purity level for your customers. So a lot of this, even heroin, meth, will come in a chunked form. When it's more pure, when it's only a step or so down from the actual cartel level distribution, and then we'll see it cut up and sold when it gets out into the retail environment into northern Michigan, whether it's below or above the bridge. So you can read that a little bit later. That gives you an idea on just some different, what some of these samples are showing, including the different forms of fentanyl that pop up there. Next slide, please. And again, this gets into some of the counterfeit tablets. We talked about that. We see all the coloration down there and the schemes. But what concerns me here is that a lot of people that we've ran into here with some of our cases working in partnership with HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, where we work with them quite closely on packages arriving from other countries, particularly Europe and Asia. And those always come into either JFK in New York, or they come into O'Hare in Chicago, and then they make their way up from there into Michigan. And people are sometimes buying these, they're trying to get what they actually believe to be oxycodone or Vicodin or what have you, because they don't want to pay the market prices that exist in Michigan. Prescription medication is expensive. And so they try to go about it that way. They go online. And what the problem is, you can't know what you're purchasing that arrives in the mail. And most folks don't have testing equipment to see what the ingredients are. And most people aren't going to be inclined to want to run over to their local MSP lab and say, would you test this for me so that I know what I have? That's not going to happen. So when you look down through here, and you can read this a little bit later, you can see that just basic amphetamine tablets, which is an upper, a stimulant, might be somebody might take that to get through their day with a little bit more energy. Well, 16 of those contained methamphetamine of the 18 tested counterfeit ones. Well, methamphetamine is quite a graduated step from amphetamine as far as the physiological effects of it. And if you look at the oxycodone, 30 of the 37 had fentanyl in that. So we see a situation there, a big step up again from oxycodone into the world of fentanyl. Neither one of them's that great, but a big change. And ecstasy, just so everybody knows, is a close relative chemically to methamphetamine. So of the 62 ecstasy, or what was purported to be ecstasy tablets, 52 of those 62 had methamphetamine in it. And you can see again on the bottom, that bottom picture, you can see how interesting and visually stimulating some of those designs are on the ecstasy tablets, whether they're legitimately ecstasy or not, and it's MDMA. And that would be interesting. Again, younger customers would pick up on that and might want to experiment with something like that. And then we start to see the development of a preference for things of that nature by young people. So next slide, please.
So we are at almost 1 o'clock. So if you don't
Okay.
mind, I'm going to open it up. There were 2 questions in the chat. And these slides will be sent out to everybody who's participating. Joanna, do you want to take the 2 questions in the chat?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. So we did get a question asking, are there any distinctive characteristics of the counties where opioid deaths are highest?
I don't know that I've seen any distinctive characteristics. We have a lot of, and even recent opioid deaths in Cadillac, Kalkaska, and occasionally in Grand Traverse. So I can't characterize it as being a socioeconomic issue, whereas in Kalkaska County, we might see people that don't have incomes as high across the board as in, say, Grand Traverse. I think we can all agree on that. So it really crosses all generational and socioeconomic platforms when you get into the opioid end of things. There are a number of different consumers, and it's not restricted by age or household income.
Thank you. And then we did get another question. Is the fentanyl pharmaceutical grade or manufactured by cartels?
Well, you might have one and the same there. I think that if you're looking at purity levels there, I would tend to believe, just based on my experience, that the cartels are fully capable, and this isn't from watching Breaking Bad, but that the cartels are fully capable of making material that is pharmaceutical grade. And it does behoove them to make that fentanyl in their environment versus trying to purchase those ingredients from a pharmacy setting or get their hands on that from some other commercial maker of the ingredients needed. And so, yeah, you've got that where the cartels, it's my understanding from the research and reading I've done, are able to go toe to toe with the pharmaceutical environment as far as the quality of what's being put out.
Thank you so much. And then somebody else wanted to similarly ask, are the opioids that the fentanyl is in, are those pharmaceutical grade or manufactured by cartel as well?
Well, you're dealing with semi-synthetic and synthetic opioids. So when you're, for instance, if you're talking about heroin, again, that in a oxycodone is a close relative to heroin as far as the effects of that and the physiological issues that develop with that. So the cartels can and do create still heroin substances and heroin material in bulk that is every bit as powerful as what is done pharmaceutically with under the trade name of Oxycontin and other names out there. So yeah, again, it's reciprocal as far as it just depends on what avenue you're obtaining that from, whether it's a legitimate base through a prescriber, provider, or whether or not you've decided to go off the grid and you've got some other contacts that you can utilize.
Thank you so much. And lastly, we had one question for Linda here. So anytime a child is missing, should the trafficking hotline be called?
Yes, I recommend it, especially if there's human trafficking, any kind of signals or signs, like if they have a relationship with somebody online, if it is something unexpected, that all of a sudden the child's missing. I had a call once from somebody who had a disabled child and needed medication and would never wander from the house. And sure enough, through calling that line, they were able to find him actually across the country, like 3 or 4 days later.
Thank you so much. So those are all the questions we received.
Thank you so much. I know we're past one, but this was such important information. Someone said it was both enlightening and depressing, and I agree. But very, very vital to know. So thank you both so much for your presentations. And we will send the slides. We will send the link to the YouTube video. Lieutenant Belcher also sent me a link to the Attorney General's office about penalties that are given to traffickers. So I'll include that in the email. And thank you for your time. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Thank you.